Sometimes the most advanced technology fails not because of complexity, but because we've forgotten the simple truths that those who built it understood instinctively. This is the story of how an elderly man with a canvas tool roll accomplished what millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment could not, and reminded an entire airbase that wisdom earned through decades of hands-on experience cannot be replaced by computer screens and digital readouts. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The massive hangar echoed with the frustrated voices of young technicians as they stared at the diagnostic screens displaying error codes that made no sense. The aircraft before them, an imposing Thunderbolt. Two ground attack aircraft, known affectionately to pilots as the Warthog, sat silent and lifeless, despite 3 days of intensive troubleshooting by some of the Air Force's most technically trained maintenance personnel. Sergeant Jake Miller wiped sweat from his forehead and glared at the diagnostic computer for the 100th time that morning. At 28, he was one of the youngest crew chiefs on the base, having earned his position through technical certifications and advanced training in the latest aviation maintenance systems. He prided himself on solving problems that stumped older mechanics who relied on outdated manual diagnostic techniques. The primary avionics bus keeps showing intermittent faults, but every module tests clean when we isolate it, Miller announced to his crew of 6 technicians, his frustration evident in his voice. We've replaced the flight computer, the backup systems, and reseated every connection point. According to every diagnostic tool we have, this aircraft should be operational. Airman First Class. Sarah Davis, the youngest member of the crew at 22, studied the aircraft with the kind of careful attention that her more experienced colleagues had learned to recognize as indicating genuine mechanical intuition. Sergeant Miller, what if the problem isn't in the electronics? What if there's a mechanical issue that's causing electrical symptoms? Miller's response was immediate and dismissive. Davis, this is a modern combat aircraft with integrated diagnostic systems. If there was a mechanical problem, the sensors would detect it and report specific error codes. We're dealing with a software or electronics issue that requires advanced troubleshooting, not wrench turning. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing through the hangar as a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sunlight. As the person approached, the technicians could see an elderly man in his 80s, wearing a simple canvas work jacket over a plaid shirt, carrying what appeared to be a rolled canvas toolkit that looked older than most of the mechanics present. Stanley Burns moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had been worn by 8 decades of use. But there was something about his bearing that suggested competence and authority despite his civilian appearance. His eyes, however, were focused not on the people in the hangar, but on the silent aircraft, studying it with the kind of intense attention that suggested he was seeing far more than just an inoperative machine. Miller looked up from his diagnostic screen and stared at the elderly visitor with barely concealed irritation. Sir, this is a restricted maintenance area. Civilian tours need to check in with base operations before... I'm Stanley Burns, the old man interrupted quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that seemed at odds with his simple appearance. General Thompson requested my assistance with your aircraft maintenance issue. Miller felt his irritation spike into genuine annoyance as he processed the absurdity of what he was hearing. The base commander had sent them an elderly civilian consultant when what they needed was advanced technical support from factory representatives or specialized military experts. With all due respect, sir, we requested a level 4 technical specialist from depot maintenance. I'm not sure there's been some kind of administrative error, but we don't need civilian observers. We need actual expertise to solve a complex avionics problem. Stanley didn't respond to Miller's dismissive tone. Instead, he continued his slow approach toward the aircraft, his eyes scanning the external surfaces with the kind of methodical attention that decades of experience had taught him was essential for proper diagnosis. That's an impressive machine, Stanley said conversationally, as if Miller hadn't just suggested he was useless. I helped write some of the original maintenance protocols for these aircraft back when they first entered service. Beautiful design, simple where it matters, redundant where it counts." Miller's expression shifted from irritation to open mockery. "Sir, these aircraft entered service in the 1970s. If you're claiming you worked on their development, that would make you—" He paused to do the mental calculation with exaggerated deliberation. "Well, that would make you approximately museum exhibit age." Several of the younger technicians laughed at Miller's joke, though Davis noticed that Stanley's expression hadn't changed at all. The old man simply continued his visual inspection of the aircraft, occasionally nodding to himself as if confirming details that only he could perceive. "Sergeant Miller," Stanley said quietly, still not looking away from the aircraft, "would you mind showing me your diagnostic readouts and describing the troubleshooting steps you've already completed?" Miller crossed his arms defensively, his body language making it clear that he considered this request to be a waste of his valuable time. "Sir, I appreciate that General Thompson sent you, but with all due respect, we're dealing with integrated avionics systems that require specialized knowledge of digital architecture and software diagnostics. This isn't something that can be fixed with old-fashioned mechanical troubleshooting." Stanley finally turned away from the aircraft to look directly at Miller, and something in his steady gaze made the younger sergeant shift uncomfortably, despite his confident dismissal of the elderly consultant's potential value. "Son, I'm not here to question your technical knowledge or your training, but sometimes the most advanced diagnostic systems can miss problems that become obvious when you use your hands and your experience instead of just your eyes and your computers." Miller's face reddened with frustration at what he perceived as condescension disguised as wisdom. "Sir, this is a program fault, not a mechanical issue. It can't be fixed with a hammer and intuition. We've run every diagnostic protocol in the technical manual, and the system clearly indicates electronic failures that require component replacement." Stanley nodded with understanding, as if he had heard similar arguments many times before. "I'd still like to take a look, if you don't mind. Sometimes fresh eyes can see patterns that familiarity has made invisible." But Miller was no longer interested in diplomatic courtesy with someone he had decided was wasting his time and insulting his professional competence. "Actually, sir, I do mind. This hangar is a controlled workspace, and civilian access requires proper credentials and safety briefings. Unless you have current maintenance certifications for this specific aircraft type, I'm going to have to ask you to leave so my crew can continue our work." Stanley reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a laminated card that he held out toward Miller without comment. The sergeant took it with obvious reluctance and examined it with the expectation that he would find some outdated credential that would justify his dismissal of the elderly visitor. What Miller saw made his eyebrows rise with surprise, though not in the way Stanley might have hoped. The identification was indeed valid and showed current access authorization for restricted maintenance areas, but the issue date made Miller laugh out loud. "This credential was issued in 1968, Miller announced to his crew, holding up the card for others to see. "Sir, I appreciate your enthusiasm for aviation, but this documentation is literally older than everyone in this hangar. I'm going to call security to escort you to the visitor center, where you can arrange for a proper escorted tour if General Thompson actually wants you to observe our operations." Stanley took back his identification with the patient expression of someone who had encountered skeptical young people many times throughout his long life. He unrolled his canvas toolkit and began removing instruments that made several of the younger technicians openly laugh: worn wrenches with non-standard modifications, measuring tools that appeared to be handcrafted, and diagnostic devices that predated digital electronics by decades. "These tools," Miller said with undisguised mockery, "look like they belong in a museum exhibit about aviation history. Sir, we use precision electronic diagnostic equipment that costs more than most people earn in a year. Your antique hardware isn't going to help us solve integrated avionics problems." As Miller spoke with such confident dismissal of Stanley's capabilities, the old man's mind drifted backward through time, triggered by the feel of his familiar tools in his weathered hands. Suddenly, He was no longer standing in a modern Air Force hangar, but was crouched beside a damaged Phantom jet on a steaming tarmac in Vietnam. Enemy mortars falling in the distance while he worked frantically to repair hydraulic damage that threatened to ground an aircraft his squadron desperately needed for the next mission. In his memory, Stanley could feel the heat and humidity, could smell the jet fuel and cordite, could hear the urgent voices of pilots who were counting on him to get their aircraft operational before the next combat sortie. His hands had held these same tools then, using that strangely bent wrench to reach a connection point that standard equipment couldn't access, making repairs under combat conditions that would save lives by keeping aircraft flying when every sortie mattered. The flashback lasted only seconds, but it reminded Stanley why he had agreed to come when General Thompson had called, asking for his help with a maintenance problem that was grounding a critical aircraft. These young technicians were skilled and well-trained, but they had never learned the lessons that could only be taught by working on aircraft, under conditions where failure meant death. Stanley's momentary mental absence had been brief, but Miller noticed the old man's distant expression and interpreted it as evidence of confusion that supported his assessment that the elderly consultant was too far past his prime to be useful. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Miller asked with exaggerated concern that was clearly intended to emphasize Stanley's advanced age to the watching crew. "Maybe you should sit down for a moment. I can call the base medical center if you need assistance." Stanley blinked and returned his focus to the present, his hand still resting on the modified wrench that had triggered his flashback to Vietnam. "I'm fine, son. Just remembering the last time I used this particular tool to solve a problem that electronic diagnostics couldn't detect." Miller exchanged amused glances with his crew, clearly believing that Stanley's claim to have solved problems that modern equipment couldn't handle was evidence of elderly delusion rather than actual expertise. "Sir, I'm sure your tools were state-of-the-art back in their day, but modern aircraft require modern solutions. This Warthog has integrated flight computers, digital communication systems, and sensor networks that simply didn't exist when you were actively working as a mechanic. Your experience, while I'm sure it was valuable in its time, just isn't relevant to current maintenance challenges." Stanley set down his tool roll and approached the silent aircraft with movements that were slow but purposeful. His hands moved across the fuselage with the gentle reverence that mechanics reserved for machines they understood intimately, his fingers tracing along panel seams and connection points as if reading information through touch that his eyes couldn't see. "Sergeant Miller," Stanley said without turning away from the aircraft, "how long has this machine been non-operational?" Miller consulted his maintenance log with the precision of someone who documented everything according to regulation. 72 hours since the initial fault report. We've logged 48 man-hours of diagnostic testing and component replacement without resolving the primary system failures." Stanley nodded as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. "And during those 72 hours, has anyone physically inspected the hydraulic actuator mounts in the weapons systems bay?" The question caught Miller off guard because it seemed to come from nowhere. The diagnostic systems had reported no hydraulic failures, and their troubleshooting had focused entirely on the electronic components that were generating error codes. "Sir, our diagnostic systems monitor hydraulic pressure continuously. If there was a hydraulic problem, we would see pressure drops or actuator failures in the system logs. The issue we're dealing with is clearly in the avionics bus, not in mechanical systems." Stanley turned away from the aircraft to look directly at Miller with an expression that carried decades of experience dealing with confident young technicians who trusted their instruments more than their hands. "Son, I'm going to share something I learned a long time ago. Electronic diagnostic systems are excellent tools, but they can only detect problems they're designed to recognize. Sometimes, a mechanical failure creates symptoms that look like electronic faults because the sensors are telling the truth about what they're experiencing, even though the root cause is something the computer can't directly measure." Miller felt his patience wearing thin with what he perceived as outdated philosophy, trying to trump modern technical expertise. Sir, with all due respect, that might have been true with older aircraft that had simple sensor systems. But modern integrated diagnostics are specifically designed to identify root causes across multiple systems. If there was a mechanical problem, the fault isolation software would trace it back to the source. Unless, Stanley said quietly, the mechanical problem is creating a harmonic vibration that's intermittently disrupting electrical connections without causing complete failure. In that case, your diagnostics would see exactly what they're seeing. Intermittent faults that disappear when you test individual components in isolation. The technical explanation was specific enough that Miller couldn't simply dismiss it as elderly rambling, but his pride and confidence in his own expertise made him resistant to acknowledging that an octogenarian civilian might understand something about aircraft maintenance that he and his advanced trained crew had missed. Sir, I appreciate your theory, but we followed proper diagnostic protocols according to current technical manuals. I'm not going to start taking apart mechanical systems based on speculation when our instruments are clearly indicating electronic failures. Stanley reached for his tool roll again, selecting the oddly modified wrench that had triggered his Vietnam flashback earlier. Sergeant, I'm not asking you to take anything apart. I'm just asking you to let me check something that will take about 5 minutes and won't interfere with your ongoing troubleshooting. Miller stepped between Stanley and the aircraft, his body language making it clear that he was done being patient with civilian interference in his professional responsibilities. Sir, I'm going to have to insist that you leave this hangar. You don't have current type-specific certifications for this aircraft. Your identification is decades out of date, and your presence is disrupting my crew's work on a critical maintenance issue. Davis, who had been watching this confrontation with growing unease, finally spoke up, despite knowing that contradicting her sergeant in front of the crew could have professional consequences. Sergeant Miller, General Thompson specifically requested Mr. Burns' assistance. Maybe we should at least let him look at what he's suggesting before we... Davis, Miller interrupted sharply. When I want input from junior technicians about how to handle civilian consultants, I'll ask for it. Until then, I expect you to focus on your assigned diagnostic tasks and let me handle personnel management decisions. The public reprimand silenced Davis, but it also crystallized her decision to take action that would bypass Miller's authority if it meant getting help for an aircraft that had defeated their best troubleshooting efforts. She quietly pulled out her cell phone and moved toward the back of the hangar, where her activity wouldn't be immediately obvious to Miller or the rest of the crew. Meanwhile, Stanley had begun putting his tools back into their canvas roll with the resigned movements of someone who had tried to help, but recognized that pride and institutional confidence were barriers he couldn't overcome through simple persuasion. Sergeant Miller, Stanley said as he secured his tool roll, I understand your position, and I respect your responsibility for this hangar and your crew. But I'm going to suggest one more time that you call General Thompson before you make me leave. I think you'll find that he has specific reasons for wanting me to examine this aircraft, and those reasons might change your mind about whether my presence here is appropriate. Miller pulled out his radio with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from believing he was about to conclusively prove that the elderly consultant was wrong and that his own judgment had been correct all along. This is Sergeant Miller in Hangar 7. I need security to respond for civilian escort off the maintenance floor. We have an unauthorized individual who is refusing to comply with proper protocols. As Miller made his call and Stanley prepared to leave rather than create additional conflict, neither of them noticed Davis speaking urgently into her phone in the shadows at the back of the hangar, triggering a chain of events that would transform this routine maintenance dispute into something with profound consequences for everyone involved. Davis pressed her phone tightly against her ear, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to the person on the other end of the line. Sir, this is Airman Davis from Hangar 7. I need to speak with General Thompson immediately regarding the civilian consultant he sent to assist with our aircraft maintenance. The duty officer who had answered the call to base operations initially responded with the bureaucratic resistance that junior personnel typically encountered when trying to reach senior command. Airman, General Thompson is in an important meeting with wing command staff. Unless this is a genuine emergency. Sir, Sergeant Miller is about to have security remove Stanley Burns from the hangar. Davis interrupted, her anxiety overriding her usual deference to rank and protocol. I don't think Miller understands who Mr. Burns is or why the general sent him. The mention of Stanley Burns' name had an immediate and dramatic effect on the duty officer's attitude. His voice shifted from bureaucratic gatekeeping to something approaching alarm. Airman Davis, did you say Stanley Burns? The civilian consultant that General Thompson personally requested from Depot Maintenance Command. Yes, sir. Sergeant Miller doesn't believe that Mr. Burns has current credentials or relevant expertise for our aircraft type. He's called security to escort him off the maintenance floor. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by rapid typing on a computer keyboard, and the sound of the duty officer speaking urgently to someone else in his office. When he came back on the line, his voice carried the kind of command authority that made Davis stand straighter, despite being alone at the back of the hangar. Airman Davis, you are to immediately inform Sergeant Miller that he is to take no action regarding Mr. Burns until General Thompson arrives personally. I'm patching through to the General's meeting right now, and he's going to want to address this situation directly. Davis felt her stomach tighten as she realized that her phone call had triggered response mechanisms that went far beyond what she had anticipated. She had expected perhaps a clarifying call from base operations confirming Stanley's credentials. She hadn't expected the duty officer to interrupt the General's meeting with wing command staff. Meanwhile, at the front of the hangar, Miller was speaking with the security patrol that had responded to his call for assistance with removing an uncooperative civilian from a restricted maintenance area. 2 Air Force security personnel had arrived and were examining Stanley's identification, while Miller explained his concerns about outdated credentials and potential security risks. This individual claims to be a consultant requested by General Thompson, Miller was explaining. But his documentation is from the 1960s, and he's been attempting to interfere with critical aircraft maintenance using obsolete equipment and outdated diagnostic theories. The senior security officer, a staff sergeant with 15 years of experience, examined Stanley's identification with the careful attention that his training had taught him was essential when dealing with access control issues. What he saw made him pause and consult a tablet computer that he carried for verifying credentials against current authorization databases. Sergeant Miller, the security officer said slowly, this identification shows current access authorization that was renewed just 6 months ago. The issue date reflects initial credentialing, but the system shows that Mr. Burns maintains valid clearances for restricted maintenance areas across all Air Force installations. Miller felt a flicker of doubt creep into his confident assessment of the situation. That doesn't make sense. Why would an 80-year-old civilian have blanket access to restricted maintenance areas unless... His speculation was interrupted by the sudden sound of approaching sirens as multiple vehicles converged on Hangar 7 from different directions across the base. Through the open hangar doors, everyone could see black official vehicles moving with the kind of urgent purpose that indicated genuine emergency response rather than routine base operations. Davis emerged from the shadows at the back of the hangar, her face pale as she approached Miller with obvious apprehension about the consequences of her phone call. Sergeant Miller, I called base operations to verify Mr. Burns' credentials. I think General Thompson is responding personally. Miller turned toward Davis with an expression that cycled through confusion, anger, and growing alarm as he realized that his routine security enforcement had somehow triggered command-level attention. Davis, you had no authorization to bypass the chain of command. When we finish with this situation, you and I are going to have a serious discussion about proper procedures for... The sergeant's threat was cut short by the arrival of General Thompson's command vehicle, which stopped directly in front of the hangar entrance with enough abruptness to suggest that the driver had been operating under emergency priority. The general emerged before his driver could open the door, his expression showing a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger that made every person in the hangar immediately come to attention. Behind General Thompson came additional vehicles carrying wing command staff, base security leadership, and several officers whose presence suggested that this had evolved far beyond a simple maintenance hangar dispute. The convoy created an atmosphere that transformed the routine workspace into something approaching a formal military ceremony. General Thompson strode directly toward Stanley Burns, completely ignoring Miller, the security personnel, and the assembled maintenance crew. His focus remained fixed on the elderly civilian who stood quietly beside his rolled canvas toolkit, watching the developing situation with the calm expression of someone who had seen many such confrontations throughout his long career. When General Thompson reached Stanley, he came to perfect attention and rendered a salute that was held for longer than protocol required, indicating personal respect rather than mere military courtesy. The gesture was witnessed by everyone in the hangar, creating a moment of profound silence as they processed the implications of their base commander saluting a civilian consultant. "Mr. Burns," General Thompson said formally, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hangar. "It is an honor to have you here, sir. I apologize profoundly for the treatment you have received from personnel who clearly did not understand your credentials or your significance to this command." Miller felt his world beginning to tilt as he watched his base commander, showing extraordinary deference to the elderly consultant he had just tried to have removed from the hangar by security forces. Stanley returned the general's salute with movements that seemed to strip away his advanced years, revealing glimpses of the military bearing he had maintained throughout decades of service. "General Thompson, there's no need for apologies. These young people were doing their jobs according to their training and understanding. I'm just here to help with an aircraft that needs attention." General Thompson's expression softened slightly as he acknowledged Stanley's gracious response, but when he turned toward Miller and the assembled crew, his demeanor shifted to something far more stern and commanding. "Sergeant Miller," the general said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that ended military careers, "I believe you and your crew are about to receive an education about military aviation history that should have been part of your technical training, but apparently was not." General Thompson gestured for his aide to bring forward a folder with classification markings. "Airmen, you are in the presence of retired Chief Master Sergeant Stanley Burns, whose service represents one of the most extraordinary records in aviation maintenance history." The revelation that Stanley held the Air Force's highest enlisted rank stunned Miller. Chief Burns served multiple combat tours in Vietnam, maintaining aircraft under extreme conditions. But his most significant contribution came when he was assigned to develop the aircraft you've been working on. He literally wrote the original maintenance manuals for the Warthog. Miller's face went pale. The elderly consultant he dismissed had created the technical foundation for all current procedures. The 30mm cannon includes mechanisms Chief Burns helped develop. His innovations are still in use today. Thompson addressed Miller sternly. "Sergeant Miller, you spent the past hour attempting to remove one of the greatest aircraft maintainers in Air Force history. Your dismissal of his credentials represents fundamental failure to understand your own expertise's foundations." Stanley stepped forward. "General Thompson, these young people were doing their jobs as they understood them. Punishment teaches fear, while education teaches better judgment." Thompson considered the wisdom. "Very well, I'll defer to your judgment. But first, you wanted to check this aircraft?" Stanley approached the Warthog, his hands moving across the fuselage, knocking gently with wooden tools. "The diagnostics are reading electrical faults," Stanley explained, "but they're detecting micro-interruptions caused by harmonic vibration in a hydraulic mounting bracket." With his modified wrench, he made precise adjustments, taking less than 5 minutes. "Airman Davis, attempt an engine start." The massive engines spooled up, systems coming online as mysterious faults disappeared. The hangar filled with applause. Chief Burns, Thompson smiled. Thank you for sharing your expertise with young maintainers who still have much to learn. 3 months later, the base implemented Lessons from Legends to bridge generational gaps. Stanley became the program's first instructor, teaching through hands-on demonstration. The most important tool, Stanley explained to 20 watching technicians, is listening to what an aircraft tells you through sounds and vibrations sensors can't quantify. He demonstrated using a wooden mallet to tap strategic points, interpreting sounds to identify issues visual inspection and electronic testing might miss. Later, former Sergeant Miller, now demoted to senior airman, approached Stanley. Chief Burns, I wanted to apologize and thank you for suggesting education instead of punishment. These months taught me more than all my previous training. Stanley saw genuine humility. You made an honest mistake. The important thing is you learned. Sir, could I ask about your time working on Phantom fighters in Vietnam? Stanley smiled at the genuine interest. Why don't you sit down and I'll tell you about keeping aircraft flying despite supply shortages and enemy attacks. It was June 1968. We had 6 jets needing to fly, but were short replacement parts due to rocket attacks. Stanley described improvisational techniques developed under combat pressure. The most important lesson was that manuals provide excellent guidance for ideal conditions, but real-world maintenance requires understanding principles so you can adapt when circumstances demand innovation. Both men understood they had come full circle from confrontation to mutual respect. Miller had learned humility and the value of experience, while Stanley discovered young technicians were capable of learning traditional skills with proper mentorship. The program expanded throughout the following year, and the base developed reputation for producing maintainers combining modern training with intuitive understanding. Stanley continued consulting for several years, traveling to bases to share techniques bridging generational gaps. In Hangar 7, his modified tools were eventually displayed with plaques describing his career, a permanent reminder that sometimes the simplest tools, guided by experience and wisdom, could accomplish what the most advanced technology could not.